NDC agenda for each of the countries in East Africa. I think, Mark, if you move to the slide 3, I think it is important as well to note that there is a growing concern around emission reduction regulations. We've seen that in South Africa. We've seen that in Kenya is now proposing a carbon tax. And I think that is going to be the direction for most African countries going forward. But again, that has a limitation. And that will actually make things worse for us as East Africans, because again, it will drive up the cost of production, it will drive up the cost of goods. So if we choose to do nothing, then in terms of decarbonizing our road transport sector, especially our road transport sector, because 90% of our transport is still by road. If we choose to do nothing, then I think we are setting ourselves up for a failure, because the discussion around reducing cost of business and making the region competitive is not going to go away until we look into some of these issues. So, Mark, if you move on to the next slide. Again, the same slide talks about another challenge that is now emerging. Now, these are emerging challenges, and they are making our region not to be very competitive, and therefore we have to reposition ourselves in terms of how do we want to do business going forward. Rising external debts. Hello. Again, as a region as a whole, we import a lot of
Mark, you need the slides are not visible. You need to enlarge the slides. People are not seeing the slides.
Mark, enlarge the slides. Yes. Okay, I think that's fair enough. That's fair enough, Mark. I think I think the biggest concern now that is emerging is the issue of rising external debts, and I think we've seen that very clearly, and John has alluded to that. We are importing a lot of fossil fuel, which has a big impact on our local currencies, which are, of course, they are weakening, which is driving up domestic lending rates, which is again driving up the foreign currency shortages we are seeing, which is now making it even difficult for us to import some of our materials. So that ripple effect is basically on our reliance on fossil fuel imports. And again, that speaks to the same agenda that we are talking about. If we choose to do nothing, particularly on the road transport sector, because 90%, again, I will mention this, in as much as we want to focus on multimodal alternative, we cannot run away from the fact that 90% of our transport today, as we speak, is by road. So that's something that we need to work on first. And again, if we can begin to look at the road and then eventually scale up to other other transport alternatives, then I think a lot of these issues we are speaking to will come out very strongly. I think in terms of the fossil fuel on our road transport, what do we need to do? Do we have an alternative other than the petrol and the diesel? So that's what this webinar is all about. And the agenda for the alternative energy is exactly what this slide, the next slide, speaks to. Mark, you can go back to the slide. Again, you can see the impact of that rising fuel, the impact of over-reliance on our road transport. You can see the impact of that on our road situation today. I think in East Africa, we have some of the most expensive road networks. It's not just about the northern corridor. The central corridor applies as well. And the other many corridors that operate within the East Africa. So that's the impact of us choosing not to spend so much time on addressing the main issues. So we have a very expensive road transport network, which of course is impacting on our cost of production, and obviously is impacting on the prices of goods. So again, I will not dwell so much on this because the whole webinar is about how do we address this agenda. How do we deepen regional trade? How do we create sustainable regional energy value chain and lower the regional road transport costs? I think that's the agenda of this webinar. And I think going forward in the next slides, we're looking forward to discussing how that can be done. Mark, you can move on to the next slide. And I think one of the solutions that we're looking at, and I think this has been mentioned before, Tanzania is best positioned to drive the agenda I've just talked about. Why is that? Because of the regional gas-powered vehicles value chain. We can actually, as East Africans, develop the regional powered vehicles, gas-powered vehicle value chain from Tanzania and scale that across the region. It can be an integrated regional LCNG model, which is basically looking at how we can set up LCNG stations across the major road transport networks in East Africa to start off with, and then eventually scale that deeper into the rest of the East African market. So that's something that is being proposed in this webinar as a solution. And if Mark, if you move on to the next slide. Sorry, the previous slide, Mike. Previous, yeah, here, there, hold it. Next. Hold it there. Now, if you look at our regional road transport today as we speak, it is actually ready for that agenda. So it's not something that we are throwing into the works. It is something that as a region, I think we are ready for it. If you look at most of our road transport options are the long haul commercial vans and matatus, and the long haul trucks and vehicles imported from Asia, mostly Asian countries. There's a bit of that from Europe. But again, this offers an opportunity for us to both to manufacture them locally in terms of how we can do the gas trucks and buses. That offers an opportunity for us to sort of see how we can manufacture them locally. And also for those who are still interested in importing, there's already a second-hand import market for these vehicles from Asia. So it's basically, it is a quick win. It is a low-hanging fruit in terms of what we need to do on our road network and how we need to go about it. And I think this is something that, as I mentioned before, the regional road transport corridor is something that is well positioned for us to sort of see how we can deep dive into this slide, pick out in terms of what is required for us to move forward. I'll move on to the next slide, Mark. And again, the next slide just speaks to the same narrative I've been talking about for the last 10 minutes. Again, the regional road transport margins are under increased pressure. Of course, that has an impact on goods and services being delivered across the region. But again, you can clearly see that it is Tanzania that is actually taking advantage of this position. So then it is natural that the country that is taking advantage of this position is actually natural that that should be the country that sort of develops the regional value chain for the gas to support the same narrative that I'm talking about. So it looks like we are all converging towards a solution that is built around having Tanzania as the regional value chain player that can then support the rest of the region in terms of sort of setting up the LCNG infrastructure, the policy infrastructure required to drive this industry because it's still young. But again, this slide speaks to the fact that in as much as it is young, but it is developing developing informally. I think that's the most important thing. If we sit back and do nothing, we are developing an informal market for fossil fuel business. So if we can take this as a weakness and turn it into an opportunity, how do we then formalize the gas business out of the informal fossil fuel business? I think that's the message from that slide. And Mark, you can move on to the next slide. And I think this slide speaks to what my colleague John has been talking about. The road network can be a good start to decarbonize our transport network, but we need to think beyond the road transport network. We need to look at how we can have a regional multimodal decarbonized transport network that cuts across the Central Corridor, the Northern Corridor, the rail, the Lake Victoria, the lakes, and of course the rivers, but also integrate that with what is happening on the Northern Corridor Green Program. So if we can have a sort of an integrated multimodal regional decarbonization transport network, I think that's the long-term planning. But for us to start this long-term planning, this long-term discussion, we have to focus on the road, because currently the road is our biggest challenge. So we need to pick up from the road and take it forward. Now, on way forward, Mark, you can move on to the way forward slide. Now, I think what we've done to jumpstart this discussion around regional road transport network and decarbonization, as part of building the much bigger multimodal regional decarbonized transport network, we've set up a team, a group of people to sort of drive this initiative going forward. So we have the African Clean Fuel Project, which is part of MafAfrique. So we will be looking at how we can jumpstart the agenda around the regional road transport decarbonization and creating the regional value chain for the gas-powered vehicles. So we will be looking at starting that discussions. So we've set up a whole list of things that we'd like to do. We'd like to share them with you so that we can get your views and then fine-tune based on the views we get from you and take this forward. Our big collaborating partner is going to be the East African Business Council. And I think I have to mention this very clearly, and I must thank John for taking the leadership, because this initiative will not take off and will not succeed without the support and the collaboration of East African Business Council. I think so East African Business Council is going to be a very, very strong partner in this agenda going forward. And just to jumpstart our agenda, we are looking at the target East African market with this transport corridor that touches Tanzania, touches Uganda, touches Rwanda, touches DRC, touches Burundi, and touches Kenya. So those are sort of the pilot countries we will be looking to engage on this agenda as we push it forward as part of the bigger multimodal regional transport decarbonization agenda. So that's where we'd like to start. And of course, like I mentioned before, I think we will see how we can position Tanzania as the regional hub for the LCNG distribution hub. Now, essentially, I will not dwell so much as to why we are doing this, but I think it is coming out very strongly. And I think that was also on a big agenda as part of the African Climate Summit, which happened last month. We are not just looking at lowering the cost of doing business across the region, but we're also looking at the Paris Agreement that the countries have signed. So I think those are sort of the main drivers of this initiative. But again, I'd like to bring out very clearly the importance of East African Business Council, because the resolutions of the second East African Business Investment Summit Expo 2023 is actually, this initiative is aligned to that resolution, because I think some of the resolutions that were made was to look at how we can promote sustainable business practices across the region, sustainable industrialization, and value chains in Africa, making East Africa a leading trade and investment destination. And I think this initiative speaks to that. So if you can support it, we are delivering on a very important agenda for the East African region. The initiative essentially, like I talked about, what we are looking at, it's a win-win for the East Africans, because at the end of the day, we all suffer the same pain. It's not a DRC problem, it's not a Tanzania problem, it's a Kenyan problem. It's not a Kenyan problem, it's an East African problem. So we're looking at how we can have the regional LCNG value chain. It's a very straightforward approach, because basically what you're looking at is setting up an LCNG logistics in Tanzania, and then sort of having the mini LCNG fuel stations across the major transport corridors in East Africa. So it's a straightforward value chain to develop, and in the essentially it's an infrastructure in the region that can scale the use of gas for transport sector, creating the green jobs, and that will support the vehicles operating across the major transport networks. The major transport networks is just the start. Eventually, it will probably roll out across all the roads. But to start it off, because we are looking at the impact of that on trade, to start it off, we are looking at the major East African corridors. Mark, you can move on to the next slide. The implications, like I said, are very clear in terms of cost. And generally, this is just a preliminary estimate we did. If you are to operate on a van or a pickup or a lorry or a truck or a bus, fossil fuel versus LNG, CNG. And clearly you can see the cost benefits of gas vis-a-vis fossil fuel. So again, in this initiative, our priority will be on the heavy commercial vehicles, lorries, buses, and the long-haul truckers, because these are the people who drive regional trade. So if that impact can be delivered across those 3 or 4 major players, then it is very easy to sort of justify its case for it to be replicated across the region. So we are sort of starting off with the big players across the region, and then eventually from that experience, it can be scaled to support other players across other small road networks. Like I mentioned before, we know very clearly the vehicle market in East Africa is mostly Japan, India, China. So we clearly know what sort of target market we'll be looking at in terms of trying to understand the industry dynamics of the gas-powered trucks, gas-powered vehicles, gas-powered lorries, buses, and long-haul truckers that will sort of position themselves to tap into this business opportunity. I think, Mark, you can move on to the next slide. Next slide, Mark. Hello, Mark, next slide.
Maybe, Baron, I see someone on the chat saying why South Sudan was excluded from the initial scoping of the project. May you comment on that?
Yes, why South Sudan has been included. I think what we are trying to look at, it's a question that yes, we will relook at. I think it's not final, because the reason of us bringing it here is to get your input. So we'll look at how we can incorporate South Sudan into the initiative, and then maybe share with you the final output a bit later. But we've not ruled out any country. I think what we were looking at is the ease of rolling it out. South Sudan is a bit on the other end of the continent. It's still part of the East African network, but again, we will see how we can incorporate South Sudan into this initiative without sort of disrupting the economic model. So yes, John, I will take that as a question that we will look into. Now, back to the presentation, the whole agenda, like I mentioned, we are simply just trying to increase regional trade. We are simply to improve our environmental ratings and compliance with the NDCs, which all the African countries have signed. So this is not something new. We bringing on board. We also want to create jobs for our youth and women in the region, because with this scaling up of the infrastructure and the new petrol stations and everything else, that's a job opportunity for our young people. But most importantly, in the short term, what we want to do is to create affordable, clean, and alternative energy for the regional road transport sector. Again, I will emphasize on this because 90% of our transport is by road. So then it makes a lot of sense for us to focus on addressing the issues of the road first, before we can look at the other multimodal concerns that will emanate out of this. And then obviously the output, like I mentioned, because this is an engagement that is sort of well structured. We are looking at reducing the costs, reducing emissions, and most importantly, reducing our foreign currency demand for fossil fuel input, because again, that will have an impact on everything else that we do across our production value chain. Now, in terms of what we need to do to drive this theory of change, I think, Mark, you can move on to the next slide. I think we want to do a feasibility study on establishing that initiative, that project I've talked about. And that feasibility study is something that would involve, Mark, you can move on to the next slide. The idea of establishing the transport corridor, call it blue, several transport corridors in East Africa, the major ones that carry the bigger bulk of the transport volumes in East Africa. So we have the Namanga Transport Corridor, we have the Dar es Salaam Mombasa Lamu Transport Corridor, we have the Northern Transport Corridor, and then we have the Southern Transport Corridor, as well as the Central Transport Corridor. So these are sort of the major, these are sort of the bigger transport networks which we are targeting as part of our feasibility study to roll out the LCNG gas infrastructure. And then, of course, the study will be based on traffic volumes, the investments required, the payback period, savings, fuel costs, reduction in emissions, the number of stations required along the corridor, and most importantly, because Tanzania is right at the center of it, and the other East African nations are also beneficiaries, we'll be looking at the policy recommendations that we need to make to the government to allow this initiative to kick off. So generally, that's what we want to do under phase one, obviously with the support of our development partners and with the support of the industry players. We hope that this can be done within the shortest possible time. Phase two, if Mark, you can just take us through, just move on to the next slide. I think phase two is about getting the policy support and the buy-in from the necessary stakeholders to get the initiative running. Now, because it cuts across many stakeholders, we have the banks and the financial institutions, we have insurance agencies, we have the regional transport industry associations. Mark, you can move on to the next slide. We have regulators, we have industry players as well, the major industry players within the region. So we have the vehicle assemblers and the manufacturers in the region. Those are key players. We have the government agencies and the regulators, and also we have development partners, UNDP, and of course our big partner in the East African market, TAC Arabia. I think these are players that we need to engage, and we need to see how we can work collaboratively to sort of get the initiative up and running as quickly as possible. And to add on to that list, Mark, you can move on to the next slide, please. We have regional trade partners who can actually strengthen the initiative because they generate the demand. The initiative sort of drives the supply side. So we have Tanzania, the PSF, Kenya private sector, Uganda, South Sudan as well, Burundi, DRC as well. Most importantly, trademark, because At the end of the day, we want to create an integrated system that is aligned to the needs of all the stakeholders. So trademark will actually be another big player in the segment. And the last phase of the initiative, Mark, if you can perhaps scroll, is to get the buy-ins and approvals from the stakeholders and the private investments to roll out the initiative. So basically, that's sort of the high-level approach of how we can achieve the agenda of deepening regional trade, creating sustainable regional energy value chain, which is the gas, and lowering regional road transport costs. So that's sort of the high-level overview of how that can be achieved and who is involved and what sort of support we need. And I think I'll leave it at there. I'll take the next sessions for Q&A, suggestions, comments, and we see how we can refine this and take it forward together with our development partners and the private sector players. Thank you very much.
Yeah, thank you very much, Belon. I think this is a very good presentation, and really it highlights some of excellent initiative you are undertaking, and also the piloting aspect is very feasible, starting with the Tanzania and then roll it out across the entire region. And also the stakeholders mapping is very, very critical, and the buy-in. Perhaps what a number of stakeholders or participants on this call, you may need to share the write-up, the presentation, but also the detailed write-up, so that the stakeholders can internalize, appreciate, and provide the required comments. As I highlighted earlier, I think the corridor approach is very important, bringing the both corridor in terms of cost benefit analysis, both the northern and the central corridor, with a view to enhance competitiveness and productivity of the corridors. So I think having that corridor approach I think is very paramount. No any country should be left behind. Both South Sudan, DRC, and even we are looking about expansion or extension to Djibouti and Ethiopia, so that the project can have a positive spillover effects on the neighboring countries. I've looked at the multiple benefits that is going to accrue to the projects, and it's very viable. The issue it is addressing are very critical, but also the job creation aspect need to be reworked on, especially the women and youth is important to bring that job creation aspect and poverty reduction aspect. So you may need to have a good technical team that may need to really look into the packaging of the project in terms of financial, economic feasibility, as well as the social impact of the project in terms of the job creation, the ESG aspect, sustainable production and consumption. It's also very, very important. But also, what I noticed among the stakeholders that corridor authorities were left out. Northern corridor and central corridor are very critical stakeholders for this project. You need to bring them on as key primary beneficiaries. They need to be brought on board. But also FEAFA. This is a Federation of Freight Forwarders in South Africa. They always play a very cardinal role in terms of the movements of goods across the region. So those are, and also look at the revenue authorities, the customs. They are also very key stakeholders. And I realize that in your stakeholder engagement, you've left out because there is also that our government always they are very always they are always risk averse. Something that has an impact on revenue, you may get a very restrictive buying because any alternative means may have an impact on the government revenue. One of the driver of the fossil fuel cost is the government taxes a lot because of the demand, because of the inelastic demand of the product. So you may also bring in the revenue, especially customs, to look at the other alternative source of revenue, so that you get a strong buy-in from the government. But finally is on the legal and regulatory framework. You may need to look at the legal and regulatory framework as well as the policy interventions from the government, the buy-in from the government where you are starting the piloting. So I see this project being, as I mentioned, it's not only regional. It has potential to be scaled up to the continental level. But it needs to be properly crafted, properly prepared. So those are my few comments. Allow me to invite other stakeholders to lay their comments, questions, suggestions as you highlighted. But otherwise, overall, count on our support as our usual support. This is the way to go in terms of sustainability of our region. Any among the participants, any question, comment, please raise your hand, or on the you can use the chat room. I see Adi. Adi, please. Adi, the floor is yours. And introduce yourself, please.
Thank you, moderator. My name is Wendell Addy. I'm the chair of the African Private Sector Summit, and I've been invited by Mr. John Bosco Kalisa to participate in this webinar. Firstly, let me thank EABC for the progressive work, not just at the East African level, but also at the continental level. We are quite engaged on looking at advancing a private sector bill of rights to secure the interest and secure and protect the interests of private sector, as well as look at policies that would drive the development of the private sector across the continent in a way that we can achieve the REX and after protocols in a very timely manner. For us at the Africa Private Sector Summit, we believe that AFTA is a gift to the continent, to the private sector, and to the continent at large, because for once our leaders were able to sit down and come up with a document that would work for everybody. But the private sector has to take that this particular Bill of Rights, the AFTA program, as a gift and drive it in a way that gives the private sector a kind of position at the table. Now, I like the highlights of the implication of doing nothing with respect to addressing the climate change on the continent. If we do not take any particular action, we're faced with currency challenges, we're faced with the climate issues itself. And of course, road is a critical component in all of this. What I didn't hear much of in the presentation is the core. I heard more about the LCNG, but I didn't hear much about electric component for transportation, because one should consider both as part of the infrastructure development along the corridors. So about a year ago, I had a conversation with a company, I think two companies, here in the States. I live in the States, unfortunately. And they have come up with kits for conversion to electric vehicles. So this is something I think that should be included in your study, so that we look at both LCNG as well as the electric cars, particularly the conversion kits for people for the existing fleet of vehicles that we have, particularly for those for consumers. In a nutshell, that's our contribution. Finally, we have the Private Sector Bill of Rights, and in the Private Sector Bill of Rights, one of the key items is infrastructure development. And so I think this is something that falls under that component. We'd like to work with you to develop what the regulation should be, what should we be asking our governments for in terms of policy, right, that everyone can sign up on to ensure that we have the proper infrastructure for road transportation, air transportation, as waterways. So these are critical. It seems that, I was talking with someone just recently, and they said to me, Wendell, the infrastructure aspect of when it comes to road and the waterways will take a lot of time. So the fastest way at this particular time would be the air transportation. So how do we incorporate air transportation to be cost effective in part of this new what they call an integration process for the continent? So I think your document should include air transportation equally, because that is also another pollutant avenue. But how do we look at cost? The fossil fuel transition is something that we have to look at from the balancing act. And it will take some time. There will be resistance because the multinationals have positioned. They have made quite a bit of investment. And it would be an uphill battle. But I think that we should look at these components objectively as we transition to renewable energy. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you, my good brother Adi. I think you've made a very important submission in terms of improving the documents. And I think my good team, Byron and others are listening. They are taking into account. In my opening remarks, I had raised the issues of electric vehicle. And I had even cited countries that are taking a proactive role. Rwanda, Kenya, and Uganda, they are on the forefront of moving towards the electric vehicle. They have even crafted incentives like in Rwanda, there are a host of incentives that are attracting people or investors who want to engage, who want to come up with innovative investment in terms of electric vehicle. And that is one way that we need to really address this issue of climate change and the issues of fossil fuels. Baron, but also I want to thank Adi in terms of the African agenda, Africa Private Sector Summit. We are part of you. We are supporting you. We need really to be at the forefront, driving the continental free trade area with regard to the protocols. So, allow me to. There were other questions raised on the chat box. One is that.
Moses, may you switch off your...
Can you to mute? There's someone who's really interrupting. Zef, could you please mute I don't know who is making noise
I've
on
done
the...
so. I've done so. Cool.
Okay. So there were other questions. Another question was that there is lack of awareness LNG and CNG, so to the private sector, but also to the users. It is a very so. What are you doing with regard to the awareness creation about the LNG and CNG? Because they are unpopular, they are unknown. So you may want, Byron, you may want to comment on that. But also, as I mentioned, the stakeholders, mapping the stakeholders engagement, and doing what we call market sounding exercise, so that you ignite the interest, both from the private sector, from the civil society, from the bankers. I'm happy you are working with Equity Bank and KCB, but also you need to look at other banks in the region that may raise their interests into the project. So, so I think over to you, Byron, to respond to some of the questions, and I'll be taking others when they come along.
Right. Thank you, John. I think those are some very valid concerns, and I think I'll try and address them. I think I'll start with concern number one around the electric vehicles. I think what this initiative is trying to do is actually to complement. We are not competing, is to complement the electric vehicle segment. Because the electric vehicle segment has limitations. So limitations in terms of cost, limitations in terms of usage, because you cannot use electric vehicles on the long-haul commercial vans, the matatus, as we call them in East Africa, the trucks and the buses. There are limitations on how much you can use electric vehicles, particularly on the heavy long-haul side, and that's where the gas comes in. So we are complementing each other. So we, in as much as we have the electric component being championed by other entities, I think we are going to collaborate and integrate such that we have a sort of a comprehensive agenda which covers both electric, covers both gas, and covers the alternative options. So it sort of is it's an integrated approach. We'll sort of see how we can work together as players across the industry and drive a decarbonized agenda. I think that has to be clear. That's number one. Number two is on the issue of LNG, CLG awareness. Yes, that's a big concern, but a lot of that falls on the policy side. You see, there's been a lot of policy drive towards electric vehicles, which is driving the awareness campaigns, but we are not seeing a lot of that on the LCNG, CNG side, and that's part of this initiative. So that's part of this initiative. Will actually to look at which is phase 2 and phase 3, to look at what will it take to get the policymakers to look at this segment and its contribution to the wider decarbonization agenda, and then look at what policy instruments needs to be put into place. And then, of course, once the private players come on board, then that will sort of drive the uptake. That's one way of looking at it. The other way of looking at it is we have the industry players. We have the local vehicle assemblies, which are part of our key stakeholders and which we are going to engage with in the course of this initiative. And I think they are going to provide input from their end on what does it take to sort of create that demand, because we are setting up the supply infrastructure, but the demand is equally important. So we will be engaging with the other players, the industry, the local assemblers, the regional assemblers as well, and sort of get their input, which will feed into the policy development. So yes, I think uptake awareness is very low, but I think with the right policies, with the right industry support, and with the right private sector coming on board, I think that will grow over time. It's just a matter of time before everything takes effect. Now, on the third concern that has been raised about integrated model, how do we incorporate the air transport as a cost-effective option? By Wendell Adi, yes, I think that's a good suggestion because again, at the end of the day, like I said before, we can start from the road transport, and then eventually we can model sort of an intermodal system which incorporates the road, the railways, and the waterways. So that this can be a start, and then eventually we can work with EABC to build something that is integrated. So yes, we will incorporate the sort of the long-term view that the region should take into this project. So I think I have addressed the questions, and I'll incorporate them into this final proposal going forward. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you very much, Baron. I think you've adequately addressed the question. I don't know if there is any other question before we come to close this webinar, and the comments will be integrated. But they also now they have shared. I think Mark, you need to share the presentation. The number of participants here have shared their emails, so I suggest you share the presentation to their emails. Any other question, any other comment, team? Colleagues? Dave, from your side, do you see anyone who has raised their hand?
I don't see anyone.
Mr. Adi.
Yes, there's one.
Maybe just to inform, most of the participants are asking for the presentation. So we're asking participants to share your email on chat, then we'll be able to share the presentation.
I have my hand up.
Over to you, Adi. Adi has raised his hand again.
All right, thank you. Just a quick question. Do we have any shipbuilding companies in any of your ports or around your ports?
Baron, can you respond to that? Any shipping companies, big shipping companies in the region? We've been lying on multinationals. Do we have regional ones, regional players?
I think we don't have any that is a big player, but I think in Kenya I think there's a Kenya Shipping Association, the Kenya Shipping Company that I think has been trying to sort of get into the market. But besides that, I'm not sure if there's any. We don't have. A lot of them are the multinationals that operate in the market. Thank you.
Yeah. If we must address our transportation modes in a more constructive way, this is something that is critical for not just the region, for our waterways and ocean, but also for the continent. And so it would be good that your study make reference to this potential business opportunity. Thank you.
I think Adi is raising an important point in which you need to integrate in your proposal, Bellon, that we need to show the opportunities for the regional players to drive this initiative, to invest in logistics. I was looking at the study done by ITC UNECA to be able to take advantage of the continental free trade area. We need around 2 million trucks. 2 million trucks. So imagine 2 million trucks. Those trucks should have use the LNG, CNG. They use some electric, but we also need investors who are going to invest in the sector. So that's what I said. Market sounding exercise is very important in terms of the potential investor in the sector who will be attracted to put in money, put in capital, and look at the return on their investment. So under your cost benefit, you also need to look at the return on investment for how long. With a span of 5 years, you may be able to recoup your capital. So you may need to do that so that we are able to. And Adi, I request you to start also looking to the US, mobilize the investors from the US who are very keen to invest in East Africa, especially in the transport sector, but also in other sectors. I know that now a number of Americans have what you call idle capital, which can be ignited or used in East Africa. So I think these are some of the discussion we need to take forward. This is the first. We are going to have more of this session in terms of targeted investors, including you, Adi. You may want to bring your money in East Africa, and the returns are very high. So I think that's the way we need to move, Byron and the team. So if you allow, I think we can. I don't know if Adi still has a hand, but everyone is looking for the presentation.
No, I'm
Adi,
good.
Oh, you're good. Okay, very good. So I think with that, I want really to thank Mark, Bellon, Zephania, and the entire team who have worked on this, and really want to thank you for you, and also thank all the participants, all the stakeholders who have participated in this webinar. We'll be having a series of this webinar. Once we have an improved version of the document, we may schedule another webinar before the year comes to an end. But we also have a dedicated sessions with investors, with bankers, with transport actors, logistics players, all the key stakeholders that have been enumerated by Byron will be contacted so that we put the market a well-packaged document. So we'll be calling on you, and I want again to reiterate what my colleague Zephania said in terms of if you could share your email address, or we'll send you the documents for further comments to get your suggestion and comments as we move forward with this noble initiative. Thank you very much, and I want to take this opportunity to wish you a blessed weekend. Asanteni sana.
Amen.
Thank you very much.
Thank you, John.
Maybe if you can remain for taking picture, and if you can switch on your videos.
Put on your camera for a group photo.
Yeah. Dear participants, you can put on your videos. Mr. Kalisa, can you put on your video?
I'm trying. I don't know why it's not coming. Maybe I'm trying to. I don't know why they've. I have a challenge with my camera. Okay. If is the gift there to help me because my camera is. I don't know why it's not.
He's coming.
Why is my camera not working? Check.